Hi, my name is Misha and I work for the Emergency Management Office in Wellington in New Zealand. I'm going to talk to you about how we're going to keep the party going after a disaster, in more professional terms, how we can plan for disaster recovery before something happens. So I've just chucked this in. Where's New Zealand? Middleearth. Who is a Lord of the Rings fan? Anyone? Yeah, cool. So contrary to popular belief, we're not all hobbits. I'm 5'11", so this is where we work. I want to get you thinking about what was the best party you've ever been to? Have a think. It might have been a few years ago, maybe it was last night with some tequila. What was the best party you've been to and why was it good? Maybe it was the food, music, we love music here. Maybe it was the people that made it a good party. Maybe it was the activities. But what does a good party have to do with disaster recovery? So this quote, a good city is like a good party. People will stay much longer than they really need to if it's a good party, right? Same as a city. If we have cool stuff going on in that city, people are going to stick around even in the hard times. But disaster recovery is sort of like the poor brother of the 4 Rs. We don't usually talk about it until after an event. So we prepare to respond. We prepare people to be able to get on with their, 72 hours after an earthquake or respond initially. We prepare in our houses. But do we prepare to recover? I don't think we often think about recovery as something we can do before something. So how can we actually do this? We can think about pre-disaster recovery planning. If we think about all the disasters that have happened in the world, there's some common themes. Obviously, every disaster has its own intricacies, own things that happen, but there are certain common themes that will come out of them. And those are the things that we can actually begin to plan for when something happens. Let's go back. What are the opportunities with recovery planning? We're looking at this in New Zealand on how we can actually put a framework in place to actually recover better, stronger, and think about all the challenges and opportunities beforehand. Things like the opportunities to create resilient infrastructure. What are the things that will happen? We know that, for instance, in an earthquake, our critical infrastructure will be impacted. So how can we plan for that? How can we understand timelines for when those things are going to be back up and running? And then the gap between where we want to be and where we are now and how we can create that resilience well before a disaster. We can create opportunities like incentives through legislation or community level impact projects to create a system for how we can actually go into recovery with this well thought out process. Housing is a critical one. We know that's going to be affected. People, after a disaster, that's one thing that they want. Housing, right? People want to be in their homes. Schools, incredibly important. Things that we can do to help, make sure that schools get back up and running as quickly as possible. Local governments are empowered, so making it really local, making everything in disaster recovery as local as possible, because those locals they know what to do. They know their local environment. People have a sense of place and psychosocial support. All of these are opportunities that we can actually think about beforehand and plan for recovery, because we know that social support is going to be major in recovery. And again, one of the, I think, big things is how we're going to govern recovery. What systems, what governance model can we put in place and know about beforehand to get things going when something happens? So if we actually start thinking about recovery as the centre of everything, because that's really the goal, isn't it? If we get something, we want to be able to recover. We build back better, we bounce back. So if we start with that recovery vision and then build on with all the different things, the readiness, the risk reduction, the response that comes from that recovery vision, then I think we'll be better placed when we get to that point in recovery to actually be able to be a bit more efficient, be a bit more community-minded, have plans in place already. And going back, one of the biggest parts in recovery we know is people. People are the centre of disasters. They're the ones that are affected. So how can we create a system where we value people's sense of place, people's knowledge, local knowledge, people's desires as the centre, as well as building back better with buildings and legislation and the environment, making sure that's taken care of. We create a community-driven recovery environment. Getting those local people can be a meaningful part in actually planning for recovery. But how we do this, how we actually go about recovery planning is how we engage. It's how we engage that matters. You know, emergency management and recovery, I'm probably preaching to the wrong group because you're all obviously interested, but a lot of community members aren't. You know, emergency preparedness might not be the sexiest topic to discuss. So how we engage with people about recovery and about pre-planning and about preparedness matters. So we can do things in recovery planning to look at how we can build capacity to be able to not only respond, but to recover within the community as well as in our governments. Increasing connectedness between different organisations, because as we know, recovery is a beast. There's so many different organisations and people involved. So how we can create that connectedness. Running workshops with focus groups is an opportunity in recovery management. Again, it kind of comes down to fostering cooperation as well, getting people talking to one another, understanding what impacts what infrastructure impacts the social environment, the housing, the schools, the church-based organisations, all of that. So engaging in different types of groups, because you know, emergency management preparedness doesn't affect, it affects everyone, but everyone differently. So we need to make sure that we're engaging with not only our recovery managers and the people that are doing the stuff on the ground, but those local groups that are such an important part of recovery. And I think what part of recovery really comes down to is if we can create an environment where people feel a sense of ownership, a sense of place, people will want to stick around and throughout that recovery, and if we can give them mechanisms through recovery planning, identifying what sort of things we can put in place, they'll be able to stay. And then the other side of it, they'll want to stay, they'll want to be involved, they'll want to be in their community. Going back to that party, we want to make sure that people still want to keep that party going after a disaster. So what are some of the key challenges or opportunities we have in pre-disaster recovery planning? So going back to that governance model, we know that, for instance, we've got regional government, local government and central government. So how can we create a system where we know exactly what we can put in place after a disaster to get things done as quickly as possible, but also involving local people and making sure that those are the right decisions for those people? So we can start thinking about those models beforehand. Resilience building through incentives. So some of the legislation that may be impacted post-disaster might not be appropriate in that disaster phase. So we can think about what are the legislation things that we can put in place now that can then just flick over into that recovery environment. Resilience building initiatives. So I talked about infrastructure lifelines and the timelines between restoration. So things like water, sewage, all those lifelines, we can look at how we can improve them day to day, which will then be impactful after in recovery to make them more resilient. Infrastructure islands, so thinking about our communities and if they're going to be isolated, how that's going to impact people working. We know, for instance, in my region, that there'll be a lot of impacted communities in different areas and isolated from landslips, from other things. How can we make sure that those communities are self-sufficient and then they can actually play a meaningful role in when we recover? Building community capacity to recover, getting that party going, making sure people are actively involved. and looking at those key areas like open space networks. So how can we make sure that if our central business districts, where a lot of the businesses are, local businesses are often a backbone to a community. So how can we make sure those businesses have good plans, and how can we relocate people? Where can we do that? Understanding where and what spaces we have available in our city to be able to do those things so that business can keep going. And again, going back to housing as well, how can we make sure that people have, somewhere to go if they don't have their housing at the moment? So what spaces and what opportunities we can create there. And that's my end of the presentation. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts on the best party they've ever been to? Comments? Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering what sort of incentives that you might think of for the local people during the pre-planning recovery stage.
Cool. So at the moment, we are sort of building a framework for how this could all be developed and implemented after recovery, but also that incentive. So, for instance, one thing is we're going to make sure that we have programs for people that can't access simple things to be able to be more resilient. For instance, water storage is an example. So how can we create incentives for people to have an ability to be able to purchase those kind of water tanks and things like that. So making it, having public and private partnerships is one thing that we can do to create incentives so people can access those things. Incentives like developing relationships with community-based organisations or faith-based organisations to build that trust so that people come on board. One of the things that we do is going to groups that are already existing in the community and asking them what do they want, what is their vision for recovery, but doing it on their terms. So it's incentivizing them to come on board because they're already involved in their local whatever they're doing at that time, but we're just coming on and trying to figure out what they're doing. So and then there's legislation, things like how we can make sure that insurance programs can go quicker and faster and people can get rehoused, and other legislation, things like that.
Thank you for this excellent presentation. How did you address the issue of the most vulnerable population? And I'm referring particularly to women. Some of them might be quite really victim of sexual violence, children, and more importantly, those who are facing tremendous health situation. And there have been more and more indication that, the overall health aspect, HIV in particular, is quite really neglected. So we need to quite really have some views on that.
And I think one of the, so important that vulnerable populations, and also I guess what we're doing is looking at what are the key vulnerable people in our communities, and one of the things that we do is actually engage with the people that already engage with those vulnerable populations on a daily basis. So sort of what I mentioned before about going to the groups that engage with those, maybe it's a women's group or maybe it's a organisation that helps people with disabilities or those vulnerable, people with elderly people, really interacting with those organisations to get them on board because they know those groups the best. So interacting with those organisations that already have that link, I think is key to bringing those people in the picture and making sure that we have planning for them. So, for instance, like our health organisations, we involve them in a lot of planning as well to make sure that those key people are factored in to when we're doing planning.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I'd just like to know how you manage the media aspect of things during these planning and preparedness and restoration issues.
It's a good question, because they can be our friend or our foe, but we want to always keep them as our friends. Social media is a key one for us right now. So we use social media so much in our day-to-day work, and part of our, I guess, philosophy around media is getting them on board with it, all the messages that we're pushing out, and using so many different ways to get messages out through different types of media. Social media obviously is a huge one where people engage heaps nowadays, so we have to be mindful of that. Thank you. I can talk to you a bit later.